My great-grandpa was in the Navy during World War II. He had some interesting stories. By throwaway 125666. Being up front, I'm not a huge fan of my great-granddad. He always saw isolation from others. When I was a kid, I heard he had fought in the war, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I wanted to ask if he ever served on a battleship or got to shoot at other ships, but he refused to say anything about it. Now that I'm older, I can get why he would want to stay quiet about a lot of the things he saw, but back then I didn't appreciate it. I just thought he was a crusty old man who hated kids. To give you some idea of what he looked like, picture Lawrence Tierney in Reservoir Dogs and add like 20 years to it. The man was practically built out of salt. Before he passed in 2015, I decided I wanted to at least make an effort to get to know him better. Great-granddad had all of 3 things to say. The government was betraying us somehow. How changed with every visit. Not to go to the ocean. I remember, once as a kid, my parents tried to take him with us to Ocean City and he screamed bloody murder until we just left. It was the most active I have ever seen him. And that I was an effing idiot for liking boys. He wasn't wrong about that. I stuck with it though. I could tell he was lonely at the retirement home, and I think he knew he didn't have much time left. Eventually, after a while, I convinced him to at least tell me about his time in the war. He agreed, as long as I brought him a case of beer every time I came over. I'm putting this out there on a throwaway because I don't want my family or friends seeing this. Disclaimer. I know nothing about ships and stuff, so forgive me if I mess up some terminology here and there. For context, great-granddad, henceforth GD, was a boatswain's mate, or a bosun's mate. He says aboard a destroyer. The ship he served on was the USS O'Reilly, a Fletcher-class destroyer. He enlisted in 1942, and as he describes, was about 5 feet 8 inches and 10 stone in weight. I won't use his or any real names out of respect. Unfortunately, he never gave me any specific dates beyond year. One thing he emphasized to me is that with the amount of crossings he did and the years he spent at sea, a lot of things just blend together after a while. And some things just end up happening so much they become boring. The first story he told me was on his first crossing in the Atlantic. His destroyer was assigned to a convoy heading to England around 42 or 43. Contrary to what I thought, GD despised the ship. The ship was one hell of a needy bitch, in his own words. I don't know quite what he meant by that until he started getting into his stories. His first crossing didn't involve fighting U-boats or anything, but it took place in the coldest part of the year crossing, the Black Pit. Essentially an area of the sea where airplanes can't cover the convoy. The waves, however, were getting high, enough that the water was essentially swamping the bow every time the ship pitched downwards. GD remembered how during the first crossing, the ocean had so much chop to it that every night he feared the ship would sink and he'd drown. Turns out, he never learned how to swim. Every night in his bunk, he'd listen to the ship groan and creak as it rose up over a wave, then a loud crash as it pitched down into the water. He never quite got used to that. The water was always perpetually freezing as well. Not quite cold enough to freeze, but certainly not warm enough to ever be comfortable. His second crossing did actually involve action. His ship and a Canadian corvette, Little Flowers he called them, were intercepting something on sonar. They thought it was a U-boat, and given it was close to the convoy, they had to check it out. As they closed in on it, it suddenly vanished. Mind you, I was a little skeptical too, but he swears up and down by the honor of the man at the sonar that the thing just up and disappeared. He said, we swept that entire area of the sea for hours. We even brought in the other destroyers too. I thought it was a thing with our equipment, but no way 4 sweepers just suddenly decided to stop working. Still, on the second crossing, a day after that, again they encountered something. This time, an actual U-boat in the late hours of the day. He said a watchman had spotted the periscope ahead of them very close. "Kraut slept on us," he said. Don't know what he meant by that. Maybe they were overconfident, or they straight up didn't notice. Either way, the captain ordered that depth charges be readied. I knew what depth charges did already and how they worked, but Great-Granddad explained further. In order to make them explode at a certain depth, we had a wrench that we would use to adjust a dial on the head of the charge, if they were the drum type. We turn that dial to make it explode this deep, so on and so forth. It was ordered that the charges be set to explode deeper than they had already been set. They were expecting the sub to dive deeper to escape. As the ship went right over the sub, they were ordered to fire depth charges. Unfortunately, one seaman who was at the rear of the ship, still adjusting the dials, didn't call that he wasn't finished. And nobody saw him, apparently. He was just resting his hand on the rack as he was adjusting, and when they dropped the charges, one of the charges rolled right over his fingers and crushed them. It was like spent tubes of toothpaste, GD said, only with a lot of blood. All the fingers, aside from his thumb, were amputated, and he was sent home. Envied that bastard. He lived in Florida, for crying out loud. The depth charges they fired unfortunately didn't make the U-boat surface, and after chasing it for some time, the U-boat apparently slipped away thanks to a decoy. We wasted an entire spread on a thing called a Pillenwerfer, he said to me. By the time we realized, the U-boat was already gone and quiet. On another crossing, they actually did get a U-boat this time. They caught it surfaced for air in the middle of a heavy fog, and while it dove down, they managed to dunk a spread of depth charges on it. I was the one to spot it, actually, GD said. Of our starboard beam. We made right standard rudder to check for any debris, and sure enough, we see a slick of oil and some scrap. But the only real way to know for sure was to look for body parts. He explained that under the immense pressure of water, and with depth charges going off all around it, a submarine collapsing underwater from pressure isn't the prettiest sight. We found some pieces and a man's head. Great-Granddad had to pause for a few seconds to think on that. Shame about that crowd. Didn't look that old. But that was the end of that. Our first U-boat. On another crossing, the phantom sonar blips happened again. Now, phantom blips apparently were pretty common. Sometimes when near shore, the sonar would ping off reefs or shipwrecks. He related a tale from a British sailor on how they dropped a few charges on the wreck of the Lustianas by accident. But these were occurring over deep water, where this shouldn't be happening. One a day. A captain of one of the destroyer escorts loses his mind, yelling about how there was a U-boat directly right of the convoy. We check it out, and there's no one left. The 2 escorts ahead ping, and there's 2 ahead. Now we're thinking, what the hell is this? There's no way these U-boats are just slipping underneath us to hang out with the ships. And then, just like that, the blips disappeared. Fleet Commodore apparently lost his shit once he heard about it, but GD didn't go into further detail. The strange thing about these blips were that they were moving in perfect formation. U-boats don't do that. Sometimes they spread out, sometimes they collapse inwards, but not like they can talk to each other down there. Otherwise we'd hear it. And every time we swept the sea with the sonar around those contacts, we'd ping more. Almost if we were pinging a wall or something big. GD stood watch one night in the middle of the crossing.
"There's no moon out, so it's pitch black," he said. "While I'm walking the ship, I saw Hutch."
Hutch was a gunner he described to me on one of the 40mm guns. He had been on a few crossings before even GD showed up.
"He was at the gunwale, climbing over. A leg from going overboard."
He grabbed him and pulled him in.
"What the hell are you doing, Hutch?"
he yelled to him.
"What were you doing?" I'll never forget what Hutch looked like. I guess he just snapped or something. He looked distant to me. He said he was climbing over because he thought he saw his wife's face in the water, calling him to jump in.
GD had him brought back below, then reported what had happened to the officer of the watch, who then reported it to the captain.
I would have been fine keeping my mouth shut about that. Some people are built differently, respond differently to stress, I think.
But according to him, the captain personally went to see Hutch to ask him about the face in the water.
I ought to be a fly on the wall for that conversation.
He didn't hear more from Hutch. He ended up getting to a different ship.
As for me, the captain told me, "Don't ever say anything about any face in the water to anyone." So I didn't.
During another crossing, GD apparently got thrown out of bed by one of the lieutenants because the O'Reilly was being attacked by a kraken. I actually laughed out loud at this. So did GD. Turns out it wasn't a kraken at all. It was actually a giant squid floating up next to the ship. Well, before giant squids were recorded, actually. It wasn't as huge as GD was hoping. He'd read about them in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea before. I'm kinda sure he was just making this one up, though.
It had eyes like dinner plates, but the skin was all pale. It moved like it had no life left in it, like something sucked the spirit from it, I guess. We all wanted to fish it up as a trophy, but the captain ordered it to be left, so we left it out there.
GD was really quiet in telling this story.
Sometimes the U-boats got through. No matter how well we did, sometimes the Krauts were better. One day, a U-boat manages to get through, nails a tanker ship. And we're talking about a lot of oil now suddenly spilling into the water. And a lot of flames now lighting it all up. That stuff just doesn't go out because it's the ocean.
The tanker dove down by the bow and sank in 15 minutes after taking 2 torpedo hits.
We saw men in the water. They were covered in oil, and they were on fire, burning, screaming for help. Convoy had a rescue ship already on site to help, but we had to stay just to make sure the bastard didn't come back for seconds. I was glad we kept our distance. Sure as hell didn't want to see what that was like.
During a lull period in a moonless night watch, GD swore up and down he heard noises from the water. Usually the only things you expect to hear are waves, maybe seagulls and the ship itself. But GD told me that he felt like he was hearing voices from the water itself, calling to him.
He sounded like a singer I heard back in a dive in Richmond with the most beautiful voice.
He thought he was going under some kind of battle fatigue and reported it to the officer of the watch, a lieutenant. The lieutenant told him, "Yeah, just ignore it." GD asked him what exactly he was trying to ignore. "Yeah, those voices, they come and go. Just ignore them." He never quite ignored the voices, but he sure as hell never reacted or showed any interest in the voices ever again. What disturbed GD wasn't the fact that he was hearing voices, it was how matter-of-fact the lieutenant was about it, as this was a thing that happened all the time.
Then I remembered Hutch, and I thought to myself, actually, does this happen all the time?
GD witnessed quite a few ships sinking in his lifetime, and told me a few. Never happily, obviously. But GD was very distraught about this one.
We were in crossing in the night. My last crossing, now that I remember, before they shipped us across the canal into the Pacific. We noticed this one ship, a Greek munitions runner, lagging behind the convoy.
The captain of the O'Reilly ordered the ship to turn around and screen it until it caught up. From what little radio chatter he could overhear, he at least thought he heard that something was causing them to slow down. Obviously, you can't just stop the entire convoy for one ship, so the convoy continues on while GD's ship goes over to render aid. That was when the sonar man called out a contact next to the Greek ship. So close, in fact, that he was sure it was underneath it.
It was beyond the Krauts to toy with us. They wouldn't sit underneath a ship for funsies. It just wasn't logic.
That was when GD saw it. He was on the bridge wing with the captain when they saw the Greek ship. A massive multi-ton cargo freighter just sink.
It was like you poked a hole in the bottom of a tub, like a drain. Just sucked the ship under, stern first. I swear by my own two eyes, I saw that water bend downwards.
He listened to the cries of the Greek crew over the radio as the ship went under in just under half a minute.
And then the sea settles, like there was never a ship there. Nobody could believe it aboard the ship. We went flank speed and just ran out of there before we were next. I remember the look of the captain.
Was he scared? I asked.
No. He just looked frustrated. Like this kind of thing just happens.
The official report to the Commodore, and to all the command above us, was that the ship was sunk by U-boats and lost with all hands. There really wasn't any real way to say that something just sucked the ship under. No maelstrom, no whirlpools, nothing on Earth could do such a thing.
We were ordered to remain quiet on what we actually saw. Reports and letters were censored heavily. We made sure to watch our gossip, because a rumor spread on the ship that we'd be thrown overboard for even thinking about what we saw. Eventually, it just became something of a myth that we told to scare new guys. Most of the crew ended up being transferred in ones or twos or small groups before the war's end. I was one of the few who remained on the O'Reilly the entire war.
I asked him why he always kept quiet about all this stuff for so long. And with the saddest look on his face, he said,
"Nobody would ever believe me."
Nowadays, I really doubt he ever actually fought in the war. He didn't leave us any heirlooms. There are no pictures of him in uniform, no letters to great-grandma, nothing. And as much research as I've been doing as of late, there's very little to actually support him going to war. I can't even find anything about the USS O'Reilly. There was a ship named it, but of a different class than GD told me. At the same time, I don't quite believe he was lying to me. What would he gain from claiming he fought in a war at his age? I don't know. He had plenty of more stories that I couldn't quite squeeze in here. I actually had the foresight to write it all down, just so I could reference it in my research. I may or may not relate more as I go on through it. Frankly, I'm quite glad he wanted to tell me these stories. and I actually understand now why he hates the ocean, at least. I have to go to sleep now, so I'll respond to stuff in this in the morning. Hey everyone, Archivist here. Thanks very much to all of you for listening to that one and for your continued support. If you're new to the channel, make sure you're following and go check out some of the other scary stories that we've got on there. And sleep well.